A good strategy for becoming a better hunter is to rehearse, after the end of the season, your unsuccessful hunts. You learn a lot. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, we went on a hunt in Selma, Alabama. This place had a pretty good reputation. I had mounted several good bucks that had come off this place. We were all excited about going. Well, the first thing that happened was, even though it was almost time or right about during the rut, the weather turned off warm. So that was the first thing that went against us on that hunt. The other thing was, I'll give you an example of 2 or 3 hunts during that hunt that the reason they were unsuccessful. One of the first places I went to, the man put me out, put me in a tripod, old rusty tripod, no telling how long it had been there, no telling what kind of human scent was around that tripod, no telling how often it was hunted. Sure enough, the few deer I saw that day skirted around me, probably 250, 300 yards. I just barely glimpsed them going around me. Another hunt that I was on that particular hunt, another day, he put me in a stand. I don't know, it was pretty tall, 12, 14 feet, but it was on a hillside. And the way the breeze was blowing, I just didn't feel good about the way my scent was being blown around. And sure enough, about 10, 15 minutes before dark, whew, what do I hear? A deer blows at me. So there's another hunt messed up. One of the other fellows on the hunt, there again, was put in he's putting us out where he wants to. We don't have any choice. And the stand that he got in had some bushes covering up a lot of he couldn't see well out of it. It just hadn't been taken care of. He glimpsed a pretty good buck, he said, went by him, and the deer actually stayed in the edge of the field. He could actually hear them grazing, but he couldn't ever see them. So as you go back and look at these things, those 3 hunts, all 3 could have been more successful with the right preparation. So when I go to a new place now, that's one of the first questions I ask, about, especially if it's on, where you're paying, if it's not a friend of yours or something, you don't know anything about it, is if I can bring my own stand, either a ground blind or a tree stand, either one. I really like a ground blind. My experience has been with a ground blind, it helps to hold your scent in a lot better than a tree stand does. I've had a lot better luck with deer not smelling me in a ground blind. And a ground blind is so quick. These new ones, you can put up in just a few minutes. And even if you just find, he's got a stand here and another one a quarter of a mile down there, just get in between there. I'd heap rather just hunt in between where there's been 2 permanent stands for years than hunt out of either one of those. Your odds are better for a bigger buck. You may not be able to see as well. Maybe those stands are designed where you got a real good view. But I just want to be where the deer hopefully find a lane where they'll be traveling, and not where they know, where humans have been. And if you got a friend that takes you to a nice place where it's been taken care of, that's totally different. I'm not talking about that. But you just want to be careful where you gonna spend your afternoon. Most of us, I may go hunting, a dozen, 15 times a year. So if I have 3 or 4 of those hunts messed up because a deer smells me or it's not in the right place, that just decreases my odds of being successful that year. Years ago, a fellow, I think his name was Charlie Driver, best I remember, it's been a long time ago. Charlie brought me a box full of deer racks, probably 50 racks in all. And he told me, he said, Court, he said, my boys and I killed these deer. As they were growing up, they were older now, they'd left home. And that some of them were broken in half and some of them were on old plaques. And he said, I just want them all put on 3 or 4 long planks where I can, display them better. And he said, now the big ones we mounted, they're at home, but these are just the ones we killed. And I said, well, y'all, and there were some nice bucks in there. And he told me, he said, I'll tell you how we killed them. He said, we killed most of them in the morning, and we liked to scout. And they would get out in an area and, get away from the clearing, from the open areas, and they would get in the thicker areas. And he said, we'd walk along fence rows or creeks or barbed wire fence and maybe see a few hares on the fence, or just maybe just a very dim trail, just some evidence that deer travel through that corridor, as long as it was thick. And then they would get on the downwind side of that. And that's what he said they did. He said sometimes we couldn't see, 20 or 30 yards. But I'll never forget just the way he said it. He said, but you wouldn't believe what come walking along them trails from about daylight till about 7:30 sometimes. And they had the evidence, to prove it. I remember a place I hunted one time. It had a big field there next to the highway, and several guys at work had seen a decent buck out there, late in the evening. Well, I want to hunt the deer, and I went looking around, and I couldn't hunt next to the highway. And I remember Charlie's story, so I got on the woodland side of this field. It's a pretty big field. I didn't know where the deer was coming in at, and walked the whole distance of it. Probably walked a quarter of a mile through the woods there, and sure enough, just found a pretty good crossing on a creek right there. And I just backed off 30 or 40 yards from that crossing. It was pretty thick on the downwind side. Sat down. Probably about an hour before dark, I saw something brown there in front of me and kept watching it. It meandered it around and came right down through that little crossing. And it was a doe. Probably about 30 minutes later, I seen the same scenario again. Saw brown out there, and this time it was that buck. Well, instead of trying to shoot him through that thicket, I just eased around and got ready because I knew right where he was coming. Sure enough, one of the easiest deer I ever shot. So it's about a strategy in being successful. I made a lot of mistakes in hunting hunting open areas. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy, like we all do, sitting in big hardwoods and watching the birds and the squirrels, turkeys, and you do see deer. But I spent too much of my time in those open areas, and I know I missed a lot of good bucks I probably would have killed over the years. I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine, Danny Doss, when Danny first started hunting, he'd come over to the house one afternoon. He was the Methodist preacher in that area, and I went to the church where he'd just moved to. We were both about the same age at that time, probably in our mid to late 20s. And so I was shooting bows in the yard, and Danny just took a real interest in it. And I started telling him about hunting, so he started hunting with me. So I take Danny with me one afternoon, and I put him out in this real pretty hard wood area and say, I'm going to be over half a mile away from you. I said, there's a couple of stands. I pointed them out to him, and I said, just you be free, you walk around, and you get wherever you want to get, Danny. Well, right before dark, bam, I hear him shoot. So I go pick him up, and he's got the prettiest buck. On the G2s, it had two little kickers that matched, pointing forward, probably one, not a monster, maybe 115 class buck. But he told me how he killed it, and he said, I just didn't think a big buck would come out in all that wide open oak trees. And from where the big clearing was, where the oak trees were, to where there was a big pasture. In other words, you had to drive across the big pasture. Then there was this little thick bottom that you had to walk through, and you come out in these big oak trees. Well, he had gotten in that little thick bottom. It was right in the middle of it. Couldn't see much. But he said, here come a couple of does right there at dusky dark, and this buck's right behind them. So Danny really showed me up bad on that hunt. There again, getting a little thicker area where that buck feels a lot more comfortable. Let me talk to you a little bit about mistakes that I think people make in shooting a deer. If you watch TV a lot in the hunting shows, like we all enjoy watching, and now we have channels dedicated just to the hunting, fishing shows. They have a tendency, I think, to be a little overcautious, you might say, but they want that deer broadside like a statue. If he moves, don't shoot. Well, he turns broadside. And I kind of understand that to a degree, but that can be overdone. But my philosophy has always been, and this may sound a little brash to you at first, but here's my philosophy: is when the shot comes, take it. Now let me explain that, because I'm not talking about anything unethical, or I don't want to wound a deer. But you're not going to always get a perfectly broadside shot. Let me tell you a couple of stories. A fellow come by my shop one day, and he said, Court, he was just sick. He said, I just saw a big old buck. He said he had like 10 points on one side. He said it was just a monster deer. And I said, why didn't you shoot it? And he said, well, I didn't have a good shot. He said he kind of walked by me, and he was walking away from me, and he said, I just didn't want to mess up. And the reason he didn't shoot it, he may not have shot, but he hunted with a real light caliber rifle, something like a 22 Magnum or 22 Hornet, and he would, shoot them, I think, in the neck or something. And that's fine, because that's what he enjoyed doing, and that's perfectly fine. But I'm going to use a caliber big enough that, just for instance, that deer walking away from me, I would have just put it on his rear end and touched the trigger. And that deer would be on my wall today. You want to reach the vitals, and you can reach the vitals of a deer from all different kind of angles. He doesn't have to be just perfectly broadside. Now, when I say when the shot comes, take it, please understand, be sure it's a deer. For what it, goodness sakes, I'm not ever talking about seeing, well, there's a brown spot, I'm just going to, and I know you don't think that. But you can positive ID a deer without having him standing perfect. If you see his ear twitch out there in the woods and you see an antler and you see his legs and you know what's behind him and around him, you real quickly, because if you don't take that shot right then, there's a good chance when he moves, he's going to be gone. We were trapping one time, and we were carrying traps out of the woods, and my hands were full and my rifle was across my back, and as we're walking along, suddenly there's just a nice buck just jumps out in the road a couple hundred yards in front of me down there. I'm going, oh my goodness, he's in the wide open, I'm in the wide open. So I set the traps down, get my rifle off my shoulder, and I get it on him. But that's a long ways, and I just didn't feel comfortable. So I squatted down to try to get a better shot, and there was a little hump, and I couldn't see him as good, so I stand back up. And I never took the shot. Finally, he took off. That took me probably 10 or 15 seconds, all that moving up and down, and he stood there. Now, if I had that same scenario to happen again, I've learned that you don't always get a perfect shot, and I've learned how to, pull the trigger fast if I need to. You can come across a deer. You're not going to be able to hold it still on that deer, but as it comes across him, if you practice this, you can pull that trigger faster and have a good chance of hitting the deer. You won't always have a perfect shot, but if you feel comfortable with it, it's a positive ID, and you know you can make the shot, take the shot.